Hi everyone, this is your host Rayan Qasim, and in this episode, my guest Neeshad Shafi from the Arab Youth Climate Movement and I discuss whose responsibility is it to cut down fossil fuels. Is it the importers or is it the exporters? And will people be able to shift as fast as we need them to? We concluded that there needs to be a global commitment to have a just transition. So tune in and I hope you enjoy it. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our second episode on the climate justice series on the Ajial podcast. I'm your host, Rayan Qasim. I'm the regional director for West Asia at Youth for Nature. And today we'll be discussing the question of, is there a balance between oil and gas economic growth and climate action in the Gulf region in West Asia? With me is our guest, Neeshad Shafi. He's talking to us from Doha, Qatar, and he's the co-founder and executive director at the Arab Youth Climate Movement in Qatar. He has also over 5 years of experience in discussing climate policies in the Middle East and the Gulf, and has several articles and interviews in many posts and newspapers, including the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Gulf Times, and other newspapers and platforms, and is also involved in many youth boards and organizations, of which some I am also part of, like the UNEP MGCY Steering Committee. I'm really happy that you're here with us. Welcome, Neeshad. I just introduced the purpose of this episode. We'll be trying to discuss how can we push for climate action when economies in the Gulf rely heavily on fossil fuel exports. And then we can discuss a little bit what alternatives the youth have to push for climate action in such conditions. So let's just switch to our first segment, which is quick questions, quick responses. Number one, isolationism versus integrationism.
Integration.
Number two, is social justice part of climate justice?
Social justice.
Number three, from 1 to 10, how much focus is given to the climate nowadays in the Gulf on average?
Well, I would give five. Things are improving how it was in 2014 and 15 when I started the whole climate movement in the region.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Neeshad. And let's now switch to our discussion. Let's jump straight into the topic. We all know that the Gulf countries, rely heavily in their economies on the export of oil and gas, and this is how they're rich countries. But we are also trying to demand climate justice and to try to solve the climate crisis issues. So here we want to talk about, is it is there a balance between demanding climate justice issues and decreasing oil and gas exports, because we know that these economies rely on these fossil fuels to subsidize all the sectors in that economy. Just to mention, before I try to maybe criticize anything, over here in Lebanon, we just discovered that we have oil and gas in the sea, and we are having an economic crisis, and probably if we are able to tap into those fossil fuels, 100% the government will take advantage of that, and the people will probably thrive because of the richness that would probably happen. And so I understand any people in the world, not just in West Asia, who might take advantage of those resources in order to gain economic advantages. So maybe you could start off by telling us, since you started this climate action movement back in 2012 or 2014, how do youth in the Gulf demand climate action? How is that atmosphere? Could you draw us that picture of how youth actually demand climate action? And in governments where we don't recognize a lot of demonstrations or a lot of actions.
Well, thank you, Ryan, and thank you for having me today on your episode of Youth for Nature. I wish you good luck on your program going ahead. Very apt question. How youth movement works or flourishes in the oil-rich countries when these are the ones we wanted to stop or we wanted to having them a transition as soon as possible. So it's important how you work on those transition at a given point of time. But the problem is not just how it starts. The problem is how it is important for young people to understand that the fossil fuel era would be not a permanent solution. It's going to be eroded off. But the fact is, as the institutions and the governments are fully involved in state economies based on the same oil-rich oil-based economy, the transition should be socially justified. Yes, we know many of the countries who have the highest fossil fuel use their part of the or their what do you call them amount of CO2 emissions have been done pre-industrial times. That is how we set whole pre-industrial times. But now it's time for an economy like the Gulf, or like you put an example of Lebanon, where the countries are coming up. If they find a sort of oil or gas rich in their geographical area, they would definitely tap in, because of course that comes as just social justice issues where you need to take up your community or the citizens out of poverty, which is the integrity of how you need to solve the issues. That's why when we talk about social justice issues, it's not just that being a fossil fuel country, you can completely transit on a night. It has to take a step-by-step thing. But yes, the climate movement in the region was always there. It's another part which I would say is that really did the young people from our region was given the right platform. They were never given that platform. They always had to struggle to come up. And today, Ryan, you and me are being known because we are part of a movement for quite a long time. And of course, we also had the struggle to be recognized for our work. Just imagine in the global north, this is not the same. So I would not say that the movement just happened one day or like a few months ago, or it didn't get a big community push or social media push it required. But ultimately, the idea was the young people from our region or here in Qatar did their bit, but it was step by step. Given the fact, world has to know that we have a different government system. We have a monarchy, and we have a very restrictive constitution, and completely the economy is fossil fuel. And given that context, if young people comes up with an idea how they want to showcase the work that they're pushing within the community, which is also important, because once the government realizes that the community realizes is fossil fuel has to be taken out transition wise in a step-by-step manner. And that realization should come from the community, because that gives the government the confidence to take the drastic measures. If public opinion comes today, do you want to do a transition today? People are like, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job. I will lose my money. That sort of thing should change gradually. And that will be only done from a community perspective, from a grassroots level perspective. And that's what we've been doing since 2012 when it started. And then we restarted in 2015 as a Arab Climate Movement in Qatar when we were officially registered as a nonprofit NGO, which is quite an accomplishment and a task, because getting those people change their narrative. For example, this happened same in Norway, which was also an oil and gas rich country in the back, and they're using the bunch of their state sovereign wealth to develop their nation, which is same philosophy what Gulf countries did. And the idea is that money now they are investing in renewables and on researchers that would definitely help. This is something the Gulf countries have to replicate or understand, that that transition can be made because of the enormous wealth we will be mentioning can be used to develop more R&D on the solar thing, how the transition can be made based on educating the young people, finding more jobs on renewable sectors, and making young people that feel that renewable is also an attractive and well-paid job. This is something what many people believe in the Gulf countries, that is a highly rich country, well-paid jobs, etc., but in a different sector, more into hospitality, more into sustainable tourism. This is something they can invest onto. But the track wasn't easy. For example, when we started, we don't have an example to showcase because our country doesn't have a lot of civil society space to do that. So what we are trying to do now would be a legacy that other groups coming in the ages when we're talking about more on democracy or more on civil society movements coming up in the region. Definitely, AYCM Qatar would be a benchmark how we did, given in that bubble, being government friendly, being civil society friendly, being an activist, but also at the same time recommending to the government. It's a quite things to pick up at the same time, but we're fortunate to do that and still keep doing that. So the idea of environmentalism and climate activism in our country didn't start overnight. We were before Greta Thunberg, and we will be here even after Greta Thunberg goes off. So, so no offense, I'm a big fan of Greta Thunberg. I had the honor to meet her, a wonderful woman, wonderful lady. I'm sure she set a lot of example for the global north and the global south as well. But to understand that we don't have a similar system, how what she does cannot be completely replicated with the same impact. We have to follow our own way of doing it because that's how things work here because of our system, the way our government works.
And I really like how you've touched base on sort of the mechanisms for youth on how to be involved in the climate action, that it's very different in West Asia, but also extremely different in that part of West Asia and the Gulf. And so you also talked about Norway and how they also relied on fossil fuels, but then they try to do the shift to renewable energy. And here I was just thinking a couple of days ago, so that the only way, or this is my opinion, and I just want to discuss it with you, that the only true way to be able to shift from the reliance on fossil fuels is to actually play the game of supply and demand. So maybe we as youth in the region can pressure like the countries that are importing the fossil fuels from the Gulf to shift to green economies, to shift to renewable energies. And that way, the demand for fossil fuels decreases. And so then, the countries in the Gulf can decrease the export and the supply that they're supplying those countries with. But at the same time and in parallel, they need to be switching to green energy at the same time because, their economies are going to be shifting, whether the countries that are importing the fossil fuels from them, or whether the resources are actually decreasing over time because those resources won't stay there forever. And at some point, you just can't export oil and gas anymore because you just won't have them. And what will happen to the economy? Like, how will the social atmosphere change? How will the economy base itself on what? Like, what will the Gulf export? If it's not agriculture, and we know why, what will it be? I know that we're both not financial and economic experts, but I feel like the community in the Gulf needs to realize that this lifestyle won't last forever. And plus, there's a climate crisis at the same time. So I know maybe the governments don't want to decrease the exports because of the economic revenue that they're making. But maybe a way is to pressure those governments importing those resources. So I ask you here, is there a balance between oil and gas economic growth versus climate action? Can we achieve that over a long term?
Well, I mean, absolutely possible. The economics says that, but how would the government do that? Because when the sole source of revenue comes from the fossil fuel industry, it is not an easy transition for sure. And also, it should be just transition. For example, now if you say the export-based country, if you campaign, some of the countries who receive the maximum oil, and probably Qatar is more a gas exporter, it goes to India. So for me, I wouldn't campaign for India to reduce it because that's sort of a livelihood. So there has to be a just movement in that transition also, because this is also a part of, I mean, the poor are paying the price. Okay, now if I don't hold China or America and I'm holding India for that, it doesn't make a real justice movement. So when we talk about the climate justice, is that it's a just movement not only for rich countries but also for the poor countries who bear the maximum for the less thing they do. For example, for the climate change, India also is a good contributor, but also given the India's magnitude of wealth, population, I mean, 30% of people are still under poverty line. And if you stop the supply, and if they don't have that alternative renewable energy source available on that level of, cheap rate or subsidized rate, this would put people into more poverty. So the campaign has to be very just movement. That's why I was always focusing on the idea. What you mentioned is absolutely fine. But let's focus South Korea. Let's focus China, who funds from get the gas from India. Let's target Singapore, who does that. But that has to be a very targeted campaign, which would definitely help. Yes, at the same time, the Gulf countries are moving towards the transition state. But yes, when you take for Qatar, they claim to have gas, which is at the moment believed to be the transition fuel before we get into 100% renewable compared to oil and coal. But green is no more that green anymore. But yes, the campaign has to go forward because oil also play a definite role. And at the same time, we have to get this information on across the borders, Ryan. The problem is that if we talk to some of our colleagues in the global north, they said, hey, you're coming from an oil-rich country, never understanding that they are the buyers of all this oil and gas. And we use the least penny of gas in Qatar because it's a 3.5 million population. It doesn't require. And of course, we have a very less amount of population consuming very low amount of fuel. But the rest goes to the country who are campaigning, hey, shut down your fossil fuel farms. This is killing our people. Habibi, understand, this is who you are buying. So the thing you mentioned, Ryan, make absolute sense that you have to target those people. And like our young community, they don't realize this fact to some extent that, okay, Saudi Arabia is killing the world with all the fossil fuel into the market. Yes. Who is the buyer? Americas, the European Union. You have to cut this node so that Saudi Arabia or all other countries are making their local commitments. I mean, all these countries in the Gulf are part of the Paris Agreement, and they're doing their bit
Yeah.
without jeopardizing their economy, which is absolutely fine to do at this point of time. But the people who are preaching us are doing their double standards too. So this is something I have to tell our colleagues in the global north, that when you look at us in the Gulf oil-rich country, yes, we didn't become rich this way. We were made rich by you, and you doesn't aware of that fact. So we have to come with facts and figures. Being an oil-rich and gas-rich country, we don't consume a lot. Okay, given the fact if you not multiply the CO2 emission for the production of that, you are also part of the same thing. But as per the mandate of the UN at this point of time, it is completely divided by the population living in that country. So that gives you as the higher per capita CO2 emitter in the world, which is for me injustice, because much of them goes to the global market. And if I divide by the 3.5 million, the per capita is the highest, which is simple mathematics. But I want to divide it with all the countries it is imported to. Look at the number. We would be 100 number, because that's a huge number of people we are supplying to India, Pakistan, you're supplying to Germany, Singapore, China. Just divide with those countries. That's the amount of CO2 we release as individually, which has to be transboundary, also has to be taken care. So that is something I want to emphasize, because many people doesn't know that, yes, we are the producers, but who make us producers? The consumers. So absolutely, Ryan, like you mentioned, we have to have a targeted campaigns to countries which are rich, who are self-sufficient, not just like poor or lower income countries. So that would be a right note to hit, telling that you made commitments to be zero emission by 2030, but you have to take care of the imports you're doing from the countries and keeping those countries rich and rich again, because that's why they're not thinking critically on their transition. Now, if you say, is Qatar very, very committed to be 100% carbon neutral? No, as long as you're buying the gas, they will not. Yes, they've been committing as a part of their Paris Agreement commitments, but beyond that, like you mentioned, Ryan, they will be keep doing what they've been doing as long as there is a global demand.
100%. I really like what you said, and sort of in the climate movement atmosphere, they tend to say, this is greenwashing. Like, you're selling oil and gas, but you're trying to shift to renewable within your country. And as you said, this is a livelihood issue. This is a supply and demand issue. And I love how you targeted, like the developed countries versus the developing countries. For example, you can't ask, like such as India and Pakistan to decrease their demand for that oil because they don't have that funding to shift to renewables. Whereas, countries like the US do have that, and we should start with them. That's a very interesting discussion to have, and it's a very focused discussion on livelihoods, because as you said, like people in Qatar rely on that, and not just the government, like the people's livelihoods, their lifestyle depends on that. And sort of also people in like in India also depend on that import. And sort of you have at one point people who are at risk of not having electricity, and people who are at risk of not having that wealth and luxury that they had. And so it's also a livelihood issue that needs to go. And it's not as simple as, hey, you're greenwashing, you're selling, and I really like that. I'd like you to touch base on a final question, Neeshad, which is, what is the best way for youth in the Gulf to demand for a better climate? And how can youth in other countries around the world support youth in the Gulf to demand for a better climate? Of course, based on what we just spoke about.
Well, Ryan, I mean, example how we can do is that what you and me is doing, Ryan, is like to collaborate with our friends in the global north, work with them so they understand how our region works and what are at stake. That's the best thing they can do. Being part of steering committees of the organization, give emphasis to global south. Of course, global south is not just us, but gives specific quota for Middle East and North Africa young people to be on board, which is definitely give them a say. And how we can do much more climate advocacy and action in the Gulf. Well, it's easy, man. I mean, the governments are proactively involved. Well, at the UN level, they've been discussing quite actively. In case of the UAE and Qatar, they've been very, very active at the UN level. At the UNFCCC, they have been quite active. The UAE is one of the ministry which has a separate UN climate department. I mean, climate ministry, and I mean that's not a norm even in the European Union countries. I mean, of course, they may sound it greenwashing, but yes, commitments are there. But of course, they would commit only without making any drastical or radical shift from their existing economic model, as long as they find an alternative. So what young people can do is push for the climate action. But yes, let us not only ask, demand our governments, but like Ryan, you said, speak to the countries who are the buyers. That guys, you have to look after for the alternative source of energy to give. I know you're a rich country and you can buy it. Also, poor countries do too, because unless the rich country provides that sort of what we call the climate fund, which is still struggling to find the amount they are really required to give it to the countries like India or Uganda or other countries who are struggling with their economy, who need support. Unless that, they will be still dependent on coal and oil, which is actually destroying. But yes, the gravity and amount is too small, and their contribution is the least compared to any other big rich countries. But the idea for young people in the Gulf is to proactively demand, keep up the community-based initiative where tell people that the luxury and lifestyle you see is not permanent, but yes, it can be in a more sustainable way. The way you clothe, you can wear more sustainable products which are available in the market. Do a sort of things and understand how much you contribute. But I would definitely see that is not the final action. I always demand that young people, you should understand that you contribute to an extent, but beyond that, it's the government. But only you realize, only then you realize that, oh, big part is by the government. As long as you don't realize what you are part of, you will never be able to do the second part. So what young people in the Gulf can do is to work within the community. You don't have to start a new initiative. Be part of the existing initiative and try to develop sort of skills to tell your parents or grandparents who still believe that, yeah, having a lot of money is life, but also telling that, our lifestyle has a big impact on some other countries where you are super dependent. Also, the fact is much of the Gulf countries are 100% dependent on food and other things. Also, we should be mindful about our food waste, anything that is imported to our country. So to understand that this sort of things in our daily life, you need to be aware that we are part of the same chain where global youth are part of, and you also have your part to do in the same. It's not that you are in the oil-rich country and you don't have to do, okay, I'm rich and I don't have to do anything. No, you have your part. It's not that your country is oil and gas country. It doesn't mean that you are not part of the global conversation,
Yeah.
because you demand your government and also the global community. It's not just the global north who's going to save this world, Ryan. It's everybody. Every young people has to take up their stage in their respective country, calling their governments and also the global governments, because every government works, together. So if you start doing a campaign in your country, definitely you will listen to the foreign office, that's the embassies, who are working within that country. So ideally, we did the same thing, working with the embassies from the European Union and the African Union. So to tell them like, hey, we understand what your country is doing. It is great. We need to work some projects in the country that will make the authorities understand, why are these kids working with the embassy? Because some of the countries like are doing extremely great things. At least from the point of announcements they make are quite radical announcements they do, which would definitely help the government to think, hey, our kids are thinking about a future which is like 100% carbon neutral. So let us think about shifting that, finding more jobs in renewable sectors, attracting more educational models where people take, different streams of engineering or arts beyond, the most what do you call them, high-paying jobs is like the chemical engineering in our part of the world, because that's and get you into the oil sector jobs. But thinking of joining in solar energy systems, economic model for future, some of the things that they can think, like, what can hydrogen can bring to the countries. And a lot of discussion about hydrogen energy system has been spoken and taught in the region. So the young people can push for those sort of things in the coming days. That would definitely shift our generation, and also thinking of our coming generation, that the jobs are not just in the oil sector, which will be highly paid, but also in the renewable sector too.
100%. Thanks so much, Nishad. I just have, one final question. Maybe you can touch base on it in just 20 to 30 seconds, not more, because we're out of time. But sort of those solutions that you were mentioning, would you think that some nature-based solutions might be one way in which like communities and the governments in the Gulf can apply as like a side solution to cutting those fossil fuel exports, sort of like you mentioned, to do sustainable shopping, but like when we talk about like on the ground projects, would nature-based solutions be something that can be applied in the Gulf, especially with the desert ecosystem?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of opportunities to do that in case of natural, like afforestation in designated areas have been quite norm in the desert countries this day. Well, when you say desert, but desert too have ecosystem. They have trees that are very well planted. For example, dates, they only grows in deserts. So you can plant those in a very large quantities to reduce your deforestation, the desertification. So as long as you have a chain of dates plants or local indigenous plants, you can cover up that area so that desertification doesn't happen quite often as it is happening at the rate right now. And also at the same time, finding so many of the countries do have mangroves. For example, in Qatar and Kuwait and the UAE, they have a not very big chunk, but at least whatever chunk of mangroves they have, they can be amplified that to a much larger area, keep it as protected as natural reserves. That would definitely help in carbon sequestration in the country. And mangroves play a key role in every country. And this can be amplified. So there are solutions even in the most tropical desert countries. Only thing you have to wide open your eyes.
All right. Thanks so much, Neeshad. This was such an interesting discussion, and I know that we could go over, 2 hours discussing this, but unfortunately, we're short on time. It was so nice to have you. Thank you so much for this, and thank you for everyone for listening. Do you have any closing remarks you'd like to tell the audience?
Thank you, Ryan. I wish good luck to your team, and I hope we also work together in the coming days. I'm really a good supporter of what you guys have been doing. My only message is, like Ryan has to be discussed. We young people from the Middle East also have a great role. We all save this world together with our young colleagues from the region and far across. And we are not left behind just because we are from an oil-rich country. We do our part. I mean, government in every country has their own mandates to approve. But we as young people are working on the same mandate, which is to push our governments and your governments to take the necessary action to mitigate climate change.
100%. Thank you so much, Neeshad. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you in our next episode. We hope you enjoyed this discussion. Down in the link below in the notes, you'll find the link to our blog post, which has additional resources on our guests, key takeaways, additional resources, and more. You'll also find down in the blog post at the bottom a link to register to the webinar that concludes the entire series with Dr. Rani Al-Masri, regional expert on colonization, social and climate justice, and political ecology, and to give you, the audience, space to come up and speak with our guests.